Marcus, the floor is yours.
Thank you, sir. Most of the things we'll be talking about are on pages 200 to 202. So let's start with 202. There's a line of about $2 billion for grants and subsidies to non-government schools. Most of that money is accounted for elsewhere and is coming in from the Commonwealth. So I just have some questions about non-government schools. 4 topics. We may be able to move through them pacily so that we can get to some other topics as well. Firstly, this is one that we spoke about last year, the non-government school, there's a non-government reform support fund, which was previously funding that came from the Commonwealth supporting independent, I think in Catholic schools too, particularly in the wellbeing space. The non-government sector was losing that fund from the Commonwealth, is my recollection, last year, and the Minister undertook that he would seek reconsideration of that federal decision to cut that fund. Is there an update on that? Is there any movement from the Commonwealth?
I can say that matter is still under negotiation with the federal government. I might ask Dr. Smith to add a few extra comments to that as well.
Certainly. As you know, the Australian government has formally paid that funding. Negotiations on the agreement are active at the moment, and Independent Schools Australia and the National Catholic Education Commission are in dialogue with Australian government officials, and I believe directly with the Minister, about the impact of the loss or not restoration of that funding on their ability to carry out reforms, particularly as some independent schools are not part of systems and so they don't have the same economies of scale. At the moment, we understand those discussions are still happening, so there's no further update.
Thank you. Prior to the last election, the Minister committed, I believe, as the opposition did within government, that the non-government sector would continue to be able to rely on 22% of SRS funding going forward, less parental capacity to pay, obviously. Does the government maintain that position, notwithstanding that there are negotiations about the National School Reform Agreement at the moment? Does the government remain committed to that position going forward?
Thank you, Member from Morialta. The short answer is yes. Obviously, I would only add to that short answer by saying, as you referred to in your question, negotiations on the broader National Schools Reform Agreement are still underway. Yes, there is every intention of keeping the commitment we made before, I think, the 2018 election, and have honoured since.
Thank you. What is the status of the low-interest loans for non-government schools program? I understand that would be operated out of SAFA and the Treasurer, but the Education Department obviously maintains a policy interest and participates in the assessment of those loans. So I'm hoping that the Minister can give at least a broad answer to that broad question.
Yes, thank you, Member for Morialta. This is handled through the South Australian Government Financing Authority, which is part of the Treasurer's portfolio, but nonetheless I'm happy to answer your question. I think some questions were put by the member for Colton to the Treasurer in their estimate session around this matter, but what I can say is that from 21 to 22, priority was given to infrastructure projects that supported increased enrolment capacity in geographic areas where there was demand for additional education provision and student retention, the refurbishment of existing facilities to provide contemporary learning experiences. The latest update I have is that the Financing Authority has informed us that there has been $148.75 million approved under the scheme and $171.25 million remaining in the scheme. The total loan amount approved for round 1 was $65.3 million. The total loan amount approved for round 2 was $65.4 million. And the total loan amount approved for round 3 was $18 million. They've advised that whilst the program is still active, There aren't currently dates confirmed for round 4.
Can the Minister confirm that there will be a round 4?
Although that is in a different minister's portfolio, my understanding is yes, and there are no plans to change the amount of funding offered in the program either. I just don't have the date of when round 4 will be.
I appreciate you taking the question. Thank you. My last question on this run, although it may provoke some supplementaries potentially, is in relation to the mid-year entry funding issue that we started touching on in the earlier session. There's a range of things I could ask, but perhaps it would be easiest if I just ask for an update on how that issue is playing out with the Commonwealth, and we'll take it from there.
Yes, thank you, Member from Morialta. We continue to lobby the federal government to reinstate the money, and we do that in unison with the non-government sector, but particularly the Catholic sector. I haven't given up hope that we can, although it hasn't been an easy process. But we know that the non-government sector has used mid-year intake to great effect. We have brought it back because we believe there is real utility in that as well, and I can say that I get a lot of feedback from families out there who are pleased that it's been returned. It comes as a complication to our school sites and to our classroom teachers, of course, because they have preschoolers and reception students starting halfway through, so I commend them on being able to accommodate this, but it's certainly been welcomed by families, and I think in light of that we have been happy to stand with the non-government sector in the strongest possible terms, pushing the federal government to put back in what is, in the context of their budget, a very, very, very small amount of money, and I have not given up hope that we'll be successful in doing that. Obviously, things were put in place in terms of transition funding, both federally and state, to get us through, which we did as a sign of goodwill from us to support the non-government sector, and I think that was a pretty decent thing of us to do, given that we have stood to lose a lot of money ourselves, which Chris will tell me if I'm wrong, but we haven't had that bucket replenished. We've just found that ourselves. But yes, the campaign to have it restored has not is ongoing, and I certainly haven't given up hope that we can be successful.
Can I confirm that this calendar year 2024 is the first year that the Commonwealth has ceased providing funding for these students, or is that, or are they funding this year and not next year?
I understand you are right. This would be the first.
So there's no funding from the Commonwealth in 2024. These students would normally be, in the last decade or so, or since it's been an issue, would have received presumably 22% less parental capacity to pay from the state government. Is the state government funding that amount to the non-government sector for mid-year entry reception kids this year, or a different amount? So the state contribution is $2.2 million, subject to actual enrolments, calculated on a per capita funding basis. And I wrote to the Association of Independent Schools and Catholic Education, I think, to advise of that at some stage towards the end of last year. And presumably that is based on the same calculation that it would have been in previous years?
I don't think it includes the loadings from memory. It is a per capita amount coming to $2.2 million, which we've done as a sign of goodwill, essentially, to try to support them, given that they, we are certainly feeling the pinch of not having that money, but I understand for the non-government sector, they are probably feeling the pinch even more. So we did it as an offer, a gesture of goodwill, but it was on a basis of per capita funding and excluding the student loadings.
The student loadings being the 6 areas that Gonski identified to extra for small schools, remote schools, students with disability, etc.
That is correct. And give me 1 second, sorry, Member from Morialta. Yes, I'll leave my answer there. I was just trying to ascertain
So as
how we calculated the 2.2.
Okay. Yeah, as it stands, is there any funding provision expected for this cohort of students in 2025 unless the Commonwealth changes their mind?
Oh, listen, I mean, I say this with all due respect, it's hypothetical in terms of how we go with that negotiation with the federal government. It's something that I'll have to consider as Minister if we get to a point where we don't think that the federal government is going to change its position. And as I said, I haven't given up hope on that, and we can assume that there'll be a federal election sometime in the next 9 months, I suppose. So hopefully decisions around this might be expedited somewhat by those political imperatives. But if we do get to a point, which we are not at yet, where I feel as Minister and the state government feels that continuing to petition the current federal government to put that money back in would be a fruitless exercise and unlikely to be successful, then we would have to turn our minds to what we do moving forward on that. But currently we have not budgeted anything, to be more specifically answer your question.
Yeah.
And I think that's right, Chris,
Thank you.
in terms of that.
And we're still on the same budget line, so my understanding of the way this was budgeted previously was that there was an assumed allocation every year from the state government going forward, because we've been paying this allocation as a state to non-government schools ever since the Federal Education Act was passed, and presumably before. So I'm wondering when the decision was taken to, was it a Treasury decision or a decision within education to cease that funding, or was it a parameter shift from the Commonwealth that triggered our state Treasury to have a parameter shift as well?
I'll pass over to Dr. Smith to give an answer to that question, Member for Morialta.
Certainly. As you may know, the amounts that are paid by both levels of government are calculated through a federal government funding estimation tool. South Australia uses the Australian government's funding estimation tool to calculate the amount due to all sectors in the state because it's more administratively efficient for us to do that. The actual determination of the funding that each level of government is required to pay is determined by the August census. The Australian Education Act and regulations actually set out the rules and the scheme for counting students in the August census. The Australian government determined that the method for counting students that was being employed as a matter of policy was not consistent with the regulation and the legislation. That was the trigger for it making a unilateral decision. And as the Minister alluded to, the funding support from the state government was partly due to the timing of that unilateral decision and its announcement, which left very little time for non-government schools in South Australia to make any plans.
I understand that, thank you. So the federal government's decision changed the tool, which automatically flowed to our Treasury assessment, and our budget assessment was always connected to that tool.
That is exactly right. So it became then a matter of policy.
Thank you. I'll move to the advocacy bodies. On page 201, there are some lines relevant. I note that if we look to the under employee benefit payments, there's an increase on last year's budget from 5.6 million to 5.793 million, and then this year's budget allocates substantially more than that. I think that the increase in this year's budget is accounted for elsewhere, but can you explain why last year's budget had an overspend of about $180,000?
I think we'll take the bulk of the question on notice, but I'll pass over to Mr Bernardi to give a bit of detail.
Yes, thank you, Minister, through you. I'll take on notice the specifics as to why that number changed. However, when there's an approved adjustment to the budget, that we process that through Treasury systems, etc. So we'll make that. We'll come back to you for the specific details as to why that budget adjustment changed.
Thank you. And I'm more than happy if the Minister wants to take these on notice unless he has the figures to hand. I'm interested in relation to this line, maybe not the employee benefit expenses, but in the overall lines for expenses and cash outflows for the advocacy bodies. Can the Minister advise if he has, what detailed level of oversight he has for these budgets? Is he, for example, able to provide the level of expense undertaken over the past year for travel by each of the relevant bodies, for food and hospitality, for advertising and so forth? And if he does have that level of detail, is it possible to be provided?
Thank you, Member for Morialta. I don't have that level of detail to hand, but we'll take it on notice and seek to provide you as many answers as we can to those questions.
Thank you very much. On page, it says here 201, there is a transfer somewhere in here from contingencies, and, oh yes, here it is at the top of 201, fourth line down, of $2.8 million. I'm wondering if the Minister can explain what that's for.
I'll hand to Mr Bernardi, then potentially Dr Smith as well, to answer that question.
Thanks, Minister. So this is new funding to the Office for Early Childhood Development as part of the Government's response to the recommendations of the Royal Commission into Early Childhood Education and Care.
So that contingency is listed there, is that within the Education Department or from Treasury's contingencies?
My understanding it's from Treasury and Finance. I'll take that on notice, but I'm fairly sure it's from Treasury and Finance.
Thank you. I have some questions on SACE.
To have Michaela Bensley, the Chief Executive, joining us here.
Welcome. Again, staying on the same page, there is a sale of goods and services line that shows 5.9 million in 22-23, going to 5.4 million last year, which was above budget, and budgeted for 4.9 million this year. I'm wondering, does this relate to SACE International, or is there, or what does this figure relate to, and why is it dropping? It's towards the bottom of page 200.
I'll pass to Ms Bensley to provide an answer, especially to take a bit on notice.
Thank you.
So it would be inclusive of all fees, so things like replacement certificates, visa, 500 students, as well as some other charges that we implement, but I'll be able to give you that breakdown at a later date.
Okay, so I appreciate that being taken on notice. In a broad sense, I mean, it is a fairly substantial drop from nearly 6 million to nearly 5 million within 2 years. Is there a broad understanding of why that drop? Is there some specific program that is not selling so well, or is it harder to define and needs to be taken on notice? Why the reason for the drop?
I'd have to take that on notice. I'm not aware of any kind of program or fluctuations that would be able to explain that.
Okay, thank you. Can I ask then, is it possible to get an update in relation to the operation of SACE International? And is there growth in the marketing and the sale of this program, or decline, or stability, I guess is the third option?
Yeah. We're excited that there is actually quite a substantial growth, particularly this year at the beginning of this half, with more schools interested in running students through our Northern Hemisphere program, which is making that much more viable in a kind of cost per student perspective. We've also renegotiated our pricing model and run a number of schools through that different pricing model, so there's a lot of interest there. And we recently, just last week, had a whole group come from on behalf and in partnership with Study Adelaide to understand the benefits of studying here in South Australia and connecting with our partners, particularly in the universities. And so we're excited for that program going forward.
I guess in my mind, I've always thought there were two clear benefits of SACE International that, if it was working well, one being encouraging, or three maybe, encouraging students from overseas to have our certificate, and especially if they're going to come and study here. Secondly, making it convenient for people who are here and travelling overseas. But the third one, and some might say very important, is actually potentially turning a profit. Mm-hmm. I'm wondering if the SACE International is currently turning a profit, and how is that going?
Yeah, it is turning a profit. At the moment, it's about 30%.
So are you able to give us an aggregate figure or the dollar figure on that?
I'll take that on notice and come back with the aggregate figure, if that's okay.
Thank you very much.
Perhaps thank you, Member Morialto. I might add a bit more information that I have to hand about the performance of SACE International. So as of 2023, it was being delivered through 25 schools in Malaysia, China, Korea, Vietnam, Vanuatu, New Caledonia and Sri Lanka. A total of 1,131 students enrolled in SACE International cohorts during the 23-24 year, compared to 1,076 in the year before, so a slight increase, which is good. But I think pleasingly the completion rate across those 2 years was 96.1 in 22-23, and then up to 98.8 for 23-24, which is a very healthy completion rate.
Just one last train on SACE. I'm interested in I haven't written them down and I forget what they're called, not for the first time, the new PLP and the new research project. My understanding is they're now embedded in schools, but is there any further work to be done? Is there any feedback coming in, and is there any possibility that SACE or the Minister might consider changing the names to something a little bit simpler?
You must refer to exploring identities and futures and activating identities and futures.
I'm not going to remember it.
Michaela will speak to the crux of your question. I take your point about the name though, but I'll pass over to Ms Bensley.
Yeah, I'll take the names certainly into consideration. So we've been piloting for 2 years now, so both of those new subjects have been accredited by the board. We have over 8,000 students now studying those in pilot. The last time, well, full implementation for EIF will happen in 2025 and for AIF in 2026.
Oh, okay.
The feedback we have is overwhelmingly positive. I'm particularly buoyed by the improvement in the relationship between teacher and student, in what happens with some of the assessment. We're also excited that students are also being able to focus on an area they're really passionate about, reflecting on their own learning, and they're being able to transfer their understanding of themselves into their other subjects. So I suppose unlike how we used to implement subjects, we're certainly not going with a set and forget. Once it does hit the system in terms of full implementation, we'll monitor and evaluate its progress, because there is a difference once you kind of go to 11.5 from the 8,000, and we'll make incremental changes as we see fit and as the community says to us. But at the moment, we're very confident around its success. We're spending a lot of time this year in supporting schools in implementation, 24 workshops for teachers that'll happen throughout term 3, and another 12 for curriculum leaders, and a range of online resources so that they're ready. But what we are hearing, and what we've, in terms of the surveying, is that people are really comfortable and ready to go and excited about the new subjects.
Could I sorry, no, I don't mean to interrupt. I just want to add something which, I'm not as expert, obviously, on the subject of EIF and AIF as Ms Bensley or Professor Westwell is, but the thing that has struck me that's important about it, I think, and may not be reflected in the name, but is a really good thing, is that a lot of it has been designed around what employers have said is lacking, which we know, I think, was the genesis of the research project originally too, but it is an important thing, stuff around resilience, and if you're coming up against a problem, not giving up and stepping away, and they're the things that employers want graduates from our system, from public, Catholic and independent schools to have when they step into the workplace. And I think EIF and AIF do play an important role in trying to address that and show those employers that we are willing to be flexible and change things within our leaving certificate to try to address what they see as deficiencies in the system.
Got time for one more? I might just stay with SACE for convenience, and I can put questions on notice to the Minister on other topics in due course. But going to page 201, in terms of both employee benefits, payments for supplies and services, there is a drop in the cash outflows for SACE. Does that reflect cuts to their base funding, or is it simply a matter of time-limited projects coming to an end?
That would be projects coming to an end, particularly the stage 2 review funding. Yeah.
Expired. I declare the examination of ministered items complete.